Hey guys, just a quick one before we get started. I recorded and finished and uploaded this video scheduled for Sunday before the news of David Lynch's unfortunate passing this past Thursday. I just wanted to say rest in peace to an absolute legend and titan of cinema. It's a shame this video covers one of his least decorated works, but I do have a video on the Elephant Man if you want to hear me praise him for a whole video, and I just felt like this needed to be added to this video because he's a filmmaker that means a lot to me. From Mulholland Drive and The Elephant Man being two of my favourite movies of all time, to Wild at Heart being the dark horse that more of you should see. So, yeah, rest peacefully, this one's for you. Okay guys, welcome back to Roulette Reviews. It's been like 6 months since our last one, so I think we should just get to another one. Welcome to 2025, the first one of 2025. If you're unfamiliar with the series, it's very simple. We have a wheel of genres, we spin the wheel, that'll lead us to an extra wheel of that genre full of films, and we spin that wheel and that dictates what we're gonna watch. We do 2 of them, we review them, and then that's kind of it. Oh, and we put them in a tier list at the end. Okay, so what are we going to get for the first Roulette review of 2025? A war film. That stinks. Okay, we're on our war wheel. Fair warning, I don't like many war movies. It's not really my genre, but that's kind of what the point of this entire thing is. So let's just spin it. Let's see what we get. What's going to take me out of my comfort zone? Oh, Platoon. Okay, I've never seen Platoon, but I'm actually very satisfied with this result. It's one I've always actually wanted to see, so yeah, let's get into Platoon. Right, so Platoon is a film from Oliver Stone, both in writing and directing, and it definitely helps that this film is created from a singular vision because the content and characters need to be handled so particularly to work. I'm always saying that the opening shot is the most important shot in a movie. I've repeated it a million times, and to apply that here, the first shot is of this dusty and hazy military camp with these young men coming off a plane entering this hell, and the first thing they see is dead bodies being carried back from where they came. A powerful image for us and a surely haunting one to begin our character's journey. Charlie Sheen's character Chris, which is our protagonist, even looks at this one guy as he walks on, this soldier who looks completely altered by what he's experienced, sort of like Chris is looking at his future. And technically before any of these shots we have an opening quote that says, "Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth," which is an important quote to open this film on because this is about soldiers in their youth. Youth that was robbed by this war, tainted by this war, but still you see its essence in small character moments. We have an all-star cast in Charlie Sheen, who yes at the time was a notable name with fairly positive connotations, Willem Dafoe, Tom Berenger, Forrest Whitaker, John C. McGinley, and the great Keith David. They're all given fantastic performances in my opinion, with Dafoe by very far running away with it. Honestly, the weakest link to me is Charlie Sheen in the lead, but he isn't terrible by any measure. To go along with these performances, the film has some really interesting ideas and themes, like the whole idea of if you die in Vietnam, it's better to be in the first few weeks, that way you won't have suffered as much, which is an awful sentiment, but it has some sadly logical thought behind it. The film also emphasizes how the majority of the soldiers are poor, they come from nothing, they have barely any education, and yet they're the ones that are here, sent to fight people they don't know, for a cause they don't know, for reasons they don't understand, in a place completely unfamiliar, in conditions they could never prepare for, to see things they can never unsee and deal with trauma they never deserved. What's interesting is that this is still largely the case. These kinds of people, the poor and mostly uneducated, are the ones that the military target for recruitment most. A big problem with this is how impressionable they can be, and also how easy it is for some of them to adapt to this lifestyle since they've never known anything much better in terms of freedom and power. It demonstrates how easily these soldiers fall into hatred for their so-called enemy, to the point of genuine cruelty and committing atrocities, but the film remains incredibly empathetic to not just their own soldiers, but to the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese these people at large. It's at times a horrific movie to watch, but is deeply saddened by the events that took place. It's a wet, muddy, and filthy movie. Maybe not the best war movie I've ever seen, not even the best Vietnam film I've ever seen, but still one I enjoyed and got a fair amount out of. So moving to the tier list, I think I'm gonna drop this one in the B tier. It's definitely a great film and an important one, but I just didn't connect with it on the scale I did with those in the A tier, and I think B is still a very great place to live, not to mention the brilliant company it's in. Okay, now with that done, let's spin the genre wheel one more time to see what our second movie is gonna be. And it's gonna be a science fiction film. Sick. This is my zone. I love this. Here we are at the very full science fiction wheel, and let's just spin it. Let's see what we get. Please let it be something good. Please. It's Dune 1984. Oh no! Okay, so Dune is one I've seen before, and I think that's what makes this worse to visit. It's a tough film to rewatch more than a first time, so this is famously a bad movie, but also granted this is riddled with the classic studio tampering, and to give it some credit, is also responsible for Lynch abandoning big budget studio movies entirely and working as independently as possible, which gave us basically every classic he ever made since, so there's that. Also for reference, I watched the theatrical version. I did not want to sit through the nearly 3-hour version for a marginally better movie. There is also a fan-made cut of the film called the Spice Diver cut, which incorporates deleted and alternate scenes as well as scenes from the extended cut, and apparently makes a much more cohesive and enjoyable film, but it is also about 3 hours long and I didn't want to risk wasting all that time, so here we are. To talk about openings again, this film opens with a monologue that exposits a bunch of information about this movie's universe and its mechanics, which is honestly pretty okay. The Villeneuve movies do this too, but they make use of it by having it done through Charlie's character. This way we get some backstory to help set us in the world, get some perspective on character dynamics, and some character development right off the bat. Lynch's Dune does this through Princess Irulan, who isn't even a factor in the movie and you'd hardly notice her presence otherwise. But the bigger problem is that these monologues continue constantly to explain concepts and characters' inner thoughts rather than letting the writing of the film do its work and trusting the audience to understand. And though I just mentioned the 2021 and 2024 versions of the film, because yes, this film attempts to adapt the whole book in one film rather than the newer films doing it in two, I'm going to avoid comparing this film to the newer ones and see how it stands on its own merits. And first of all, it has some great sets. It's one thing people will and have always praised this movie for: the miniatures, the sets, the designs, costumes and mats employed to make this film are super impressive, even by today's standards, and I do enjoy the visual style of this film. I would say the computer effects have aged, but they were awful on impact, let's be honest. I mean, when considering every original Star Wars film had already come out and were all made on a lower budget than this, it's hard to really defend Dune with the age argument. Kyle MacLachlan as Paul Atreides is fine enough. I think he went on to be a better actor later, but he works here, as does most of the cast. But despite the material, no actors here feel particularly challenged. Although I do want to quickly shout out Brad Dourif, who captured every moment he was in. Also, Sting as Fade is weirdly pretty good. The main problem with this film is that it attempts to shove in this entire book's worth of content into a singular film, which works for other adaptations of other books, but in the case of Dune, it's such a densely packed book and so much of it is necessary as well as complex, so the end result of that is less of a movie and more of just a straight up chapter by chapter reading of the book that feels stiff and convoluted. Not to mention the amount of weird stuff it adds or changes. If you're not already familiar with the work, either by the later adaptations or the book, this movie is tedious to follow and will likely never draw you towards being a fan of the world or Frank Herbert's concepts. The combat scenes are weird, they're just like kids playing make-believe, none of it feels weighted or real, which is another problem with the film overall. immersion. I can't really explain why, maybe because it mostly feels like a table read when characters interact, but it's just difficult to get immersed in this world. The score is absolutely booming though, incredible orchestral music that just unfortunately sits on this weird, messy and kind of boring movie. I certainly don't think it's one of the worst movies of all time, and in a year of Supergirl and Rhinestone, it's not the worst of its year either, but it just isn't one I can root for. Also, before wrapping this part up, I urge everyone to go and watch the final battle between Paul and Fade from this film. It is so bizarrely made, there is no tension, and it genuinely feels like a practice run. It's such a weird scene. Oh, and the credits are absolutely nuts. So moving this to our Roulette review tier list, I'm gonna have to sit it in E. It's fairly terrible, but not completely offensive and nowhere near the worst thing I've ever seen. I know I said I wasn't going to compare it to the newer films, but if it were not for their existence, this probably would be higher. It's just hard to have such a better alternative and still advocate for this even slightly. But that's just me. Have you seen either of these films? If so, what did you think of them? If not, will you? And whether it's one based on the Vietnam War or one based on the sci-fi works of Frank Herbert or not, as always, keep watching movies.